is that the information itself comes from the mind of the person who writes the hieroglyphics or who writes the letter, okay? Nature can preserve that information or it can degrade it, but it cannot generate it. Nature can't write the hieroglyphics, nature can't write the letter, okay? Oftentimes they'll say, well, we have no idea, but eventually science will find the answer. And they're continually telling us science will find the answer. And in this area of the diversity of biological life, they've been saying that for 150 years. So it's kind of like, the Darwinists are kind of like compulsive gamblers. They're always promising to pay their debt in the future, you know, and they just keep going further and further in debt. Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. So we are in our module on science and science questions related to the Christian faith. And we've been talking over the last few weeks just about the various questions about origins. So we've talked about the origin of the universe, the origin of cosmos, and what we've seen. And then last week we talked about the origin of life. And what we've seen is that science, particularly the more recent discoveries in science, are not pointing away from God. They're not pointing away from theism, but actually they're pointing towards God. They're pointing towards theism, and they're pointing towards biblical faith. And so now we want to talk today, I want to talk about this question of the origin of the species. Okay, so how do we get all this diversity of life? So last week we talked about life, how did we get life, and what do we know from science about the origin of life? And then the question arises, okay, how do we get from the very first life, how do we get to all of this diversity and just magnificent splendor of diversity of living organisms that we see today? And of course the materialist or the naturalist, he has an answer, or he believes that he has an answer, and typically the answer is in Darwinism or neo-Darwinism that we'll talk about today. And the question is, do we have to buy that? Do we have to accept that explanation for all the magnificent life that we see around us? Again, there's a list of resources there for you if you want to read more about it. The first few are very readable at the popular level. So I think I've mentioned John Lennox's book before, God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? Is a very readable book. Michael Denton has written a couple. We'll talk some about some of the things that he has written. Today, he wrote, a number of years ago, he wrote Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. And then more recently, he updated that book with another one, Evolution, Still a Theory in Crisis. Jonathan Wells has written a couple books. Again, several years ago, he wrote a book, Icons of Evolution. He looked at a number of the examples that are typically given of supposed evolution. So he looks at things like the peppered moths and the finch beaks, the Darwinian finch beaks from the Galapagos Islands, and a number of different what we call icons of evolution. And then he revisits that again in his book Zombie Science, And he talks about how even though there's been a lot of discovery made over the last number of years that have disproved many of these icons, that they're still being propagated, they're still being discussed in high school and college textbooks and that sort of thing. Tom Bethel is he's a very famous journalist who approached the question of Darwinism from a journalist perspective, and he wrote the book Darwin's House of Cards. At a little more advanced level, David Berlinski is not a Christian. He's actually a secular Jew. But he wrote a book, The Devil's Delusion, which was a response to Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And he's just got a lot of tremendous stuff in there. And he's kind of a funny guy to read, too. He's got quite a dry sense of humor. He's kind of fun to read. And then at the more advanced level, Stephen Meyer, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt are two best-selling books. Michael Behe has written 3 books. His first book was Darwin's Black Box, was written back in the 90s, and then in the early 2000s he wrote The Edge of Evolution, and then more recently, we'll talk about today, he wrote the book Darwin Devolves. And then there are 2 Baptist theologians who have written a book, 40 Questions on Creation and Evolution. That's a very practical, very helpful, very readable book, actually. And then there is the book Theistic Evolution, a scientific, philosophical, and theological critique. And this is edited by several scholars, and there are contributions from a number of scientists and philosophers and theologians who examine the proposal of what's called theistic evolution, which we'll talk about a little bit today, and demonstrate the problems with the idea of theistic evolution, both from a scientific, from a philosophical, and from theological perspective. And we'll talk a little bit more about that today if the Lord gives us enough time. Okay. So, of course, the term evolution gets thrown around a lot and actually means a lot of things. We all believe in evolution, right? I believe in evolution because I've experienced it. I'm different than I used to be, right? So one definition of evolution is just change over time, okay? And we all see that. That's clear. Nobody doubts that things evolve, things change over a period of time, right? But then there's another way that the term is used. It's used to refer to what is called common descent or universal common descent. And the idea of universal common descent is that all living things have a common ancestor. They all come from one beginning living organism of some sort, usually some kind of one-celled thing that we talked about last week, how it supposedly popped into existence in the prebiotic soup and all that sort of thing that we talked about last week. And so there's the idea that you have this original cell or this original living organism, and that all other living organisms grow out of that. So you have what's called universal common descent. We all descend from some common ancestor. And then a third definition of the word evolution is this idea that if you take random mutations and natural selection together, and again we'll talk about those things here in a few minutes, that if you take random mutations and natural selection, that there's some kind of creative power in the combination of those two things, and that has generated all the diversity that we see. And typically, when they talk about random mutation and natural selection, by random mutation they mean completely unguided. So the typical evolutionist or Darwinist, when he's talking about random mutation, he is specifically, and Darwin was very articulate, very specific about this, they're excluding any involvement of God, any involvement of a theistic God in that random process, okay? So those are the ways that it's some of the ways that the word is frequently used, and you'll hear it used. And particularly the second definition and the third definition are elements of what we think of as Darwinian or neo-Darwinian evolution. And so as we're talking today, that's what I'm talking about. When I'm using the word evolution today, unless I indicate otherwise, I'm talking about those second two definitions. We're either talking about common descent or we're talking about mutations and natural selection. Okay? One thing we want to keep in mind that's important to keep in mind is a distinction between microevolution and macroevolution. Okay? So microevolution just involves, again, talking now about living organisms, okay, is talking about small changes over a period of time. So these are not massive changes like changing from a dinosaur to a bird or whatever, but we're talking about small changes over time which involves adaptations within a species, okay? And there are a number of examples of that. So, for example, we think about bacteria and the way bacteria within the species, they can change, they can adapt, they can become resistant, for example, to antibiotics and that kind of thing. There's the example, again, that's oftentimes used of the beaks of finches on the Galapagos Islands, oftentimes called Darwin's finches, although he himself didn't actually discover it. It was discovered after his time. But the idea, and you're probably familiar with this from high school biology class or whatever, that the beaks of some of the finches on the Galapagos Islands changed over a period of time as the environment changed, it became drier or wetter or whatever. They changed, and then they changed back again, okay? So this would be an example of change over time, but very small changes within a species. Oftentimes, this is very controversial now, but it was accepted at face value for many years. The whole peppered moth thing from England, that peppered moths change depending on the environment of the trees in England as a result of pollution. We're familiar with this in the breeding of livestock and the breeding of dogs. And so oftentimes people will say, well, obviously evolution is true because look, we breed dogs, okay? And you take a dog and you breed it a certain way and then you get certain features, okay? This is what we call microevolution, okay? And the thing about microevolution is it's really not controversial. Everybody accepts it, okay? Creationists, intelligent design people, full-blown Darwinians, everybody recognizes that you get changes within species. You get these small adaptations that occur. Now, how they occur is another question, and we'll talk a little bit about that today here in a few minutes. But it's widely observed. We see it all the time. We see it when we breed dogs or cattle or whatever. We see it, for example, with bacteria as they develop resistance to various antibodies or whatever. We've seen it with COVID-19, right? So COVID starts out in one particular form, and now they're talking about various forms that are popping up around the world, okay? So this is a very non-controversial concept, the concept of microevolution. But then we get to macroevolution. And this is a different animal altogether. No pun intended there, by the way. But macroevolution involves the production of new body parts, okay, and ultimately entirely new species. So now we're not talking about these small adaptations where a beak changes or the shape of a dog changes or one breed of dog has longer legs than another. But that's not what we're talking about. But we're talking about entirely new body parts, and we're talking about entirely new species ultimately developing. Okay, this is what we refer to as macroevolution. And macroevolution is what's controversial. Macroevolution is what we're going to call into question today. Okay, it's never been demonstrated. All right, it's never been observed. It's never been proven to have happened. So it's never been demonstrated that a species can develop entirely new body parts, or that one species can transition over a period of time into an entirely different species. It's never been demonstrated, for example, that as long as you breed dogs, you're always going to get dogs. You're never going to get something other than a dog. Okay, it's never been demonstrated or proven. Okay. Furthermore, this whole idea of macroevolution is really counterindicated by something that's called homeostasis. And what we mean by homeostasis is that if you go back in geological time, you look through the layers of the earth and go down in geological time, you discover where certain species appear in the geological record, in the time record from geology. They appear, and then they either still exist, or at some point they go extinct. But when they go extinct in essentially the same shape in which they appeared. Okay, so the idea of homeostasis is when a particular species appears in the geological record, from that point on it remains largely the same. Again, there may be those microevolutionary adaptations that we can see, but we don't see the kind of new body parts or new species that develop. Scientists, biologists, paleontologists, they have looked and looked and looked to try to resolve this question, this problem of homeostasis. And so as they look in the fossil record, as I said, as they examine the fossil record, they see this characteristic of homeostasis, of the stability of a species from the moment it appears in geological time until it either goes extinct or up until today. But not only that, there had been a number of laboratory experiments done. So, for example, they've done many experiments with fruit flies, and the reason is because fruit flies multiply so quick you can get a lot of generations. And so experiments with fruit flies, they've produced thousands and thousands of generations of fruit flies. They have never managed to get a fruit fly to develop a new body part. Now, they did have one situation where a fruit fly did develop an extra set of wings, okay? But the problem was it killed the fruit fly, okay? So it wasn't something that aided in survivability. So it has to actually aid in survivability. It has to be something that can be passed on to subsequent generations, right? So, and then another really fascinating experiment has been done by a biologist by the name of Lenski up in Michigan. And this has been going on for like 30 years now. So they took some E. coli, the bacteria, and they started just reproducing. Again, they're doing this because they reproduce several generations in a day, okay? So they're able to just get many generations of E. coli. And so now, at the time I typed these notes up, whenever that was, a couple of years ago or whatever, when I typed these notes up, they were up to 65,000 generations, okay? And in 65,000 generations, they have never yet been able to prove macroevolution. They've never been able to develop the E. coli bacteria into a different species or even into, for example, new body part. They haven't been able to develop it beyond that, okay? They did manage to get some E. coli that would reproduce faster. Okay, but that again is a microevolutionary development, and even that is fast. We'll talk about that in a few minutes about that. It's kind of fascinating when they discovered how that happened. Okay, so I'm making this distinction between microevolution and macroevolution. There are some biologists who object to that distinction. Okay, just for the record, we need to know that, and you may encounter some who object to that distinction. And what they say is, well, there is no such thing as macroevolution. Everything is just these small incremental changes, and as they pile up over time, then you get these more substantial changes that we talk about in macroevolution. So that's the argument, that new body parts and new species just come as a result of these tiny changes that occur over many thousands or millions of years. Okay? But Michael Behe has demonstrated, particularly in his book, The Edge of Evolution, is there is a limit to how much those microevolutionary changes can accomplish. There's a certain limit to what they can do, and they can't go beyond there. So there does seem to be a marked line somewhere, okay, and exactly where that line is is still open for debate, but there does seem to be a marked line between microevolution and macroevolution. Okay? So the real question that we're faced with is, and we've talked about this before, how do you through this process of microevolution, or however, how do you develop the new genetic information that you need in order to create a new body part? Okay? So take the finches, for example, Darwin's finches there on the Galapagos Islands. So you can get a change in the shape of the finch's beak, okay? And then, as I said, as the environment changed back, the beaks changed back to their original shape, all right? So you can get that, but how do you get new body parts? Because in order to get new body parts, you have to have new information in the genes of the living organism, of the organism. You've got to have new information. Where does that information come from? How do you get that information? And that's really the question that we're dealing with, and that is to some degree where the line is drawn between microevolution and macroevolution, is that macroevolution requires significant new information in the DNA or in the genes, okay? So obviously things really took off on this idea of evolution after the publication of Darwin's book in 1859, The Origin of the Species. So what was it about Darwin's idea that was really so new? Because actually this idea that biological life had somehow evolved has been around for a long time, okay? So it's been around even from the time of the Greeks and the Romans. There were people back in the ancient world who tried to understand how do we get all this diversity of life, and they thought somehow maybe it happened through some process of evolution. And even in the Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment area in the 17th and 18th century and after that, you get people speculating about this kind of diversity of life arising somehow through some kind of process of change, okay? But nobody could really explain how it could have happened until you get to Darwin, okay? And what Darwin did is he put together two concepts. He came up with an explanatory mechanism by which things could evolve, all right? And his mechanism included two things. The first was random mutation. So he envisioned, of course he didn't know anything about the cell and that sort of thing, but he just envisioned that animals would somehow spontaneously develop a new body part or whatever on this kind of global level. And this would just be random. It'd just be a random product of nature. There was no God involved or whatever. These things would just happen. But that idea was already kind of around, but what was really significant was Darwin's addition of the explanatory tool that then preserved that in the population, and that's natural selection. So natural selection, of course, is that whole idea of survival of the fittest. So a organism has a mutation. Most mutations are destructive and harmful, but some mutations are beneficial. And so what would happen is if an organism had a mutation that was beneficial and helped it survive, then it would have more descendants, it would reproduce more, and then they would reproduce more, and eventually that mutation would become fixed within the population of that particular species or organism, okay? And this is what really then lit the fire under this whole idea of evolution. All right, and the naturalists and the materialists, of course, were quick to grab onto it. But what we need to recognize is that Darwin was making two assumptions, and Darwinists after him are making two assumptions. Sometimes they'll openly state them, sometimes they're just kind of hidden back there in the background, but they're making two assumptions. And the first assumption is that these random mutations are always unguided. They're completely random. They're just a product of accidents in nature, and there's nothing guiding those mutations. Okay, that's the first assumption. The second assumption is that somehow by compiling these advantageous mutations on top of each other, you can eventually get very complex, organized functional features. Okay, so by adding enough of these advantageous mutations, you can get from a one-cell bacteria to a human being. Okay, that's the idea. And those are two assumptions that underlie all Darwinism, right? The problem is, as Michael Denton points out, I mentioned him earlier, as Michael Denton points out, regarding that first assumption, the assumption that all these random mutations are unguided, that's a philosophical assumption. That's not a scientific fact. There's no way to prove that a random mutation is unguided. Okay? Now, by definition, when a Darwinist uses the term random, he means unguided. Okay? But there is no scientific evidence that a mutation is unguided. All right? So Denton says it's an entirely unsubstantiated belief for which there is not the slightest evidence whatsoever. So there is no evidence, and there's no way I can conceive of we could ever get evidence that mutations are unguided. Maybe they are, but there's no way to prove that. Then he calls into question the second assumption, this idea that by compiling these mutations together, you can ultimately get these complex forms. And regarding this, Denton says, the claim that gradualism can generate the sorts of complex systems throughout the biosphere is again, not only is it unsubstantiated, but in many cases is beyond the realm of common sense that such things have ever happened. Okay? So this idea that you can get complex forms through these kind of random mutations, he said, it just goes against common sense. It's interesting, just this past week I've been reading some about C.S. Lewis and some of the C.S. Lewis's ideas and thoughts, and one of the things that C.S. Lewis was really big on was the value of common sense, the importance of just plain common sense. And particularly he was talking in relationship to this whole idea of scientism and that science supposedly has the answer to everything. And there's been other books that have been written along this line too. Doug Axe has written a book called Unbelievable that kind of draws on this same idea. That common sense tells us that if you're having these kind of accidental mutations, you're not going to be able to get complex organisms. And in addition to that, we don't have any evidence that it does work. Okay? Contrary to the claim of many evolutionists. Now, you've heard me using the term neo-Darwinism or new Darwinism, okay? And the reason we use that term today is because when you think about it, in Darwin's day, in the 19th century, when he was writing, nobody knew anything about the cell. Okay, the cell was just a glob. I remember, in fact, when I was back, and I'm going to date myself here, but when I was back in high school in biology class, we didn't know much about the cell. Okay, so we didn't know much about the cell back then in Darwin's day, and they certainly didn't know anything about genetics. They didn't know anything about DNA. The cell was just kind of this glob. They had no conception of the cell that we saw last week in that little video clip we showed last week. They had no conception of anything like that. Okay, the cell was just kind of a glob. All right, and so for Darwin, when he's talking about mutations, he's talking about mutations on kind of the macro scale or the more global scale. You know, the development of an eye, or the development of a wing, or the development of a leg, or whatever. Okay, but when you get up to the 1930s, then comes the discovery of genetics. So you have the discovery of genetics in the 1930s, and then of course in the 1950s you get the discovery of, early 50s you get the discovery of DNA, and then in the mid-50s you get the discovery of the code within DNA, and this revolutionizes Darwinian theory. Okay, so so you get then the development of what is now called neo-Darwinism. And neo-Darwinism is no longer looking at so much changes at the global level or trying to explain changes at the global level. They're seeking to explain the changes that take place at the genetic level. So changes within the DNA, okay? So when we're talking about neo-Darwinism, we're still talking about Darwinism, but we're talking about that focus on what happens in the cell, in the DNA, at the genetic level, and even with epigenetic information, okay? And with neo-Darwinism, there are three pillars. There are kind of three primary things that are essential for neo-Darwinism, and two of them we've already talked about. The idea of variation or mutations, and then the second one is natural selection at work, okay? And then the third one is whatever these changes are that take place in the DNA, if I have something that happens within my DNA, in order for evolution to take place, that has to be inheritable. I have to be able to pass that change in my DNA onto my children, to my progeny, okay? So you have these three elements, variation, natural selection, and heritability, which are essential in what's called neo-Darwinism, okay? But as Michael Denton, the title of Michael Denton's first book, the theory, Darwinian theory, really is a theory in crisis. There are a number of problems with Darwinian theory, okay? And I've listed a number of them for you there. There's problems with the fossil record, the issue of information we've talked about before, the problem of what's called devolution, a point that Behe has just recently brought out, the problem with molecular evolution, the problem with cellular evolution, the problem of irreducible complexity, the problem of mathematical probabilities we talked about last week, just the improbability of these things happening in the time that's allotted. How do you get new body plans? Before you get the part, you have to have the plan. The existence of just consciousness and the ability to think. How does that arise by accident? How do values arise, good and bad? The idea that some things are good and bad. How do those things arise just by strictly materialistic, naturalistic evolution? There's tremendous failure in the area of tree of life. Okay, I don't have time to look at all 10 of these. Let me just mention very quickly, we'll look at some of them in more in depth, but just let me mention a couple things real quickly. On the tree of life, it actually turns out now we have two tree of lives, okay? Because we have what's called the morphological tree of life, which is based on looking at the external structure of organisms and trying to figure out how did this one descend from this one and what is the order they descended in, okay? And so you remember the tree of life you saw in your high school biology textbooks is the idea you start again with this universal common ancestor, and then everything kind of grows out of that and branches off of that until you get like this, what's called the tree of life, right? Well, if you look at organisms from an external look, you just look at them externally and their body parts and that sort of thing, you construct one kind of tree of life, okay? But it turns out when you look at the genes, when you look at the DNA and you compare organisms by the DNA, you get an entirely different tree of life. So different things originated from different ancestors, depending on whether you look at it morphologically or you look at it genetically, right? Not only that, but each one of those trees has problems within itself, okay? So we'll talk a little bit more about this next week when we talk about the question of the evolution of humanity, of humans. So, but at any rate, that's just one of the problems. We've talked about the problem of consciousness and cognition and values before. We talked last week about the problem of probabilities. Mathematical probabilities are just astonishingly, just make it seem astonishingly impossible that the kind of evolution that we're talking about could have occurred within the time frame that scientists believe that they have. But let's look more in detail at some of these. So, take, for example, the fossil record. So we've already talked about this issue of homeostasis. So species appear in the geological record at a certain point, and then they remain largely unchanged until they go extinct, or, until we see them today. Okay? So this is a major problem in the fossil record. In addition to that, you have missing intermediate steps. And it's not like you have a few missing steps, but you're missing more steps than you've got steps, okay? So there are huge gaps in the fossil record. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about some of this in a little more detail next week. And then there's the problem of what's called the Cambrian explosion. So if you dig down through the layers of the earth, you get down to what's called the Cambrian layer, okay? And this is regarded to be a particular time period in geological time, okay? And what we find in the Cambrian explosion is that within a very short period of what's called geological time, okay, so within a very short period of geological time, you get all the major animal groups appear suddenly within that one layer. So they all appear in the Cambrian explosion. And biologists simply cannot explain this, okay? So, in fact, one of the leading evolutionists is a guy by the name of Eugene Koonin, and he says about the Cambrian explosion, he says, major transitions in biological evolution show the same pattern of sudden emergence of diverse forms at a new level of complexity. So all of a sudden, at one point in geological time, you get this sudden appearance of all the major animal forms in their complex form. Okay? So there's not anything kind of leading up to it, where you get more and more complex until you get to this level of... It just suddenly appears in the Cambrian explosion. And actually, the Cambrian explosion is only one of a number of similar explosions like that the fossil record just simply cannot explain. And I've got several of them listed for you there. Notice the last one is there, the origin of the genus Homo. So the genus that we're a part of, okay, so we'll talk about this next week. The genus that we're a part of appears suddenly, okay, in the geological record. So there's a problem in the fossil record. Then there's a problem, as we talked about last week, with molecular or chemical evolution, okay? So there's no publication in the professional literature that offers any kind of an explanation of how molecular evolution could have occurred or did occur. So there's nothing in the literature that explains how chemicals themselves could have evolved to get the kind of complex molecules that we were talking about last week. Things like carbohydrates and proteins and things like that. Now there are a number of just kind of ad hoc assertions that says, well, it might have happened this way or it might have happened that way. But there's nothing in the literature that has been supported at all by experiments or calculations for molecular evolution. Then when we move up from the level of molecules to the level of cells, we run into the same problem. So again, Michael Denton says, molecular biology has also shown us that the basic design of the cell system is essentially the same in all living organisms on Earth, from bacteria to mammals. So he says the basic structure of the cell is the same from the very simplest one-cell organism all the way up to you and the cells in your body. Okay? So there's a lot of difference in the cells, but the basic structure is the same. He says, therefore, no living system can be thought of being primitive or ancestral with respect to any other system, nor is there the slightest empirical hint of an evolutionary sequence among all the incredibly diverse cells on Earth. So you have all these different cells on Earth, but there's no sequence that's obvious in the record of these cells down through geological time and throughout the species, okay? So we don't have chemical evolution. We don't have evolution at the level of the chemicals, and we don't have any obvious evolution at the level of the cell. Now, if you don't have evolution at the level of the cell, then how do you get all the diverse forms of life that we have today? It's really quite a puzzle, right? And then there's the problem, I'm kind of lumping two of them together here, of information and what's called devolution, okay? And of course we've talked about information a lot already over the last number of months, okay? But we get this, particularly in the Cambrian explosion and these other explosions I talked about, we just get a sudden appearance of vast amounts of information in the DNA, okay? This guy Peter Medawar and William Dembski have postulated what they call the law of the conservation of information, okay? And in the law of the conservation of information, they say that neither chance nor necessity nor the combination of chance and necessity together are able to generate specified complexity or complex specified information. So what they're saying is that just chance happenings in nature that aren't directed by God or whatever, just chance happenings in nature, or necessity, and what they mean by that are the laws of nature. There's nothing in the laws of nature that says nature has to act this way, that can produce complex specified information, the kind of information we need to have complex organisms, okay? And then they go on to say the crucial point, Dembski goes on to say, the crucial point in the law of conservation of information is that natural causes, talking again about just chance and necessity, the laws of nature, is that natural causes can at best preserve specified complexity, or they may degrade it, but they cannot generate it. Okay, so imagine you're on an expedition into Egypt, okay, and you go into you dig your way into a pyramid and you get in there and you find hieroglyphics written on the wall of the pyramid, okay? And you're well trained and scholarly, and so you are able to translate those hieroglyphics and figure out what the guy said who scratched those hieroglyphics into the pyramids, into the walls of the pyramid 3,000 years ago, okay? Well, what you have there is you have information. Okay? And that information has been preserved by the protective climate, the shelter of the pyramid, the dry climate, that sort of thing. So there's information that was in the mind of the person who wrote the hieroglyphics, okay? There's information there. That information has been preserved through nature, okay? But it didn't generate that information. The information was generated by the mind of the person who scribbled the hieroglyphics, right? Or on the other hand, you write a letter to, does anybody do that anymore? Write letters anymore? You write a letter to a friend, okay? You put it in the mailbox, you send it, okay? And it gets there, but the problem is, and I'm not saying anything about our model postal service, but I know these things happen. The letter falls out of the mailman's pouch or whatever and falls in the street, and it rains that night, and the wind blows, and then the sun comes out the next, and by the time you find the letter, the paper is starting to deteriorate, the ink is all run, the information is lost, okay? Again, what we have here is the natural processes at work. In this case, they didn't preserve the information, they degraded the information. You can no longer tell what it was your friend wrote, okay? So this is what they're talking about, is that the information itself comes from the mind of the person who writes the hieroglyphics or who writes the letter, okay? Nature can preserve that information or it can degrade it, but it cannot generate it. Nature can't write the hieroglyphics, nature can't write the letter, okay? Now, when you think about that, in addition then to the discoveries that are now being made that Michael Behe talks about in his latest book, Darwin Devolves, just published a couple years ago, in which he's talking about research that's been done just within the last 10 to 20 years. And what he talks about in his book, Darwin Devolves, is that these microevolutionary changes that we talked about, okay? Whether it's bacterial resistance to antibiotics or whatever it is, okay? That in a number of these cases, when they studied it and they found out what happened in the DNA that made these changes possible, what they discovered is that what happened in the DNA is not that new information was added, but that parts of the DNA, some of the genes were either degraded or destroyed or turned off. Okay? This is what he refers to as de-evolution. So he gives several examples in his book where we know, for example, how did the polar bears get their white fur? Well, actually now we know how they got their white fur. They had brown fur before, but there's a degradation or turning off of a particular gene in the polar bear that makes their hair white. Okay? So what he's pointing out here is that you can have these kind of degradations that occur that turn out to be beneficial. Okay? So, for example, you probably don't, but maybe you do have the latest, hottest, fanciest, most tricked out Lexus there is, okay? Layla's shaking her head. I saw your post about your 200,000 mile van yesterday on Facebook. So, yeah, we probably don't. But suppose you had just the fanciest, most tricked out Lexus, but you find yourself with it in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and you're hundreds and hundreds of miles from civilization, and you've got half a tank of gas, okay? Well, you're thinking, okay, what am I going to do in order to survive to get to civilization? Well, the first thing you start doing is you start taking things off the Lexus, right? you start taking off all the stereo and then pretty soon you're throwing out the seats and you're taking off the hubcaps and you're taking off the lid of the trunk. You're stripping it down so that you can get better gas mileage, right? So by actually degrading the car, you can gain an advantage, okay? Well, that's what's actually happening in many of these cases of microevolution, is that you're getting some kind of immediate advantage, but that immediate advantage is happening by the loss of information or the degrading of information or the turning off of information in the DNA, okay? So when you think about that, though, these kind of beneficial mutations or changes in the DNA that are actually the degrading or the loss of information, these things actually are going to happen more frequently than say, the addition of information. Of course, we know that even can't happen, okay? So what happens is, as an organism continues to exist, it's going to begin to accumulate these degradations which may serve to give it some survival advantage. But ultimately what that does is, from an evolutionary point of view, that's taking that organism down a dead end. It's losing information. And the more information it loses, the more information that's degraded, that's information that is no longer available to it. By the time you get out of the desert, you can't play your stereo, and so it is with organisms. If they continually are losing information to gain some kind of immediate advantage, then that information is no longer available for them down the road, and they are in what we would think of as an evolutionary cul-de-sac or an evolutionary dead end. That's as far as they can go. Okay. And so this again, from Behe's perspective, this again is one of the what we call limits to evolution or the edge to evolution. There are certain things that evolution can do, but it can only go so far, and this is one of the reasons. Because these kind of evolutionary developments, these kind of mutations that actually degrade the gene, actually take it down an evolutionary dead end. This is one of the reasons why it seems pretty clear that macroevolution is not possible. Then, of course, we've talked about irreducible complexity before. For the sake of time, I'm just going to kind of go through this very quick. So there are mechanisms within the cell. Some of them we saw last week. Mechanisms or machines within the cell. There are many, many of them. There are many other things about human biology and biological life. There's something called the blood clotting cascade. There's just a number of things like this that are so complex, and they require everything to be present for it to work. Okay. So you think of Behe likes to use the example of a mousetrap. So a mousetrap has all these various parts, but for a mousetrap to even have a justification for existing, it has to have all of those parts. You take away any one of those parts. You take away the staples, you take away the hammer, you take away the spring, you take away any one part, and it no longer has a reason to exist because it can't catch mice. It has no other purpose, right? So he says these kind of things are irreducibly complex. You cannot reduce them and still have a functioning organism, right? So each part is unique, and each part is essential, and each part has to be there for the overall thing to even have a justification to exist, right? So the example, one of just many examples in biology is what's called the bacterial flagellum. So this little device here, and I believe I showed this to you before, but this little device here is a propeller on the tail end of a bacterium, okay? And it's just made up of proteins, all right? And it has 40 different parts, 40 different parts. And every one of those parts has to be there for the flagellum to do the job it's designed to do, which is to be a propeller to move the bacteria through a fluid, okay? So there's a stator, there's a rotor, there's a U-joint. It's just a classic example of a boat motor, right? And Behe's point is that all of those things have to be there, or there's no justification for the bacterial flagellum to exist. So if you had all of those parts except for the propeller, or if you had all those parts except for the stator or the rotor, then it wouldn't work. If it doesn't work, then it's a hindrance to the organism, and it would have been filtered out by natural selection. Okay? So the only reason that natural selection would have preserved it is if all those pieces were there all at once, all together, all functioning, right? So a complex propeller mechanism by which bacteria is enabled to move. It consists of some 40 parts, each of which is necessary for its function, and without which the mechanism would have no purpose and could not have evolved piece by piece. Now, in order to try to refute this idea, some scientists have suggested, well, there's co-option. And what co-option, the idea of co-option is, well, these other parts they were in other parts of the cell, they were being used for other things, and they got co-opted and brought together to make the flagellum. And I've actually I've heard scientists over you make that defense. But the problem is, for example, with the flagellum, is like I said, there are 40 parts, and there are nowhere near there's nowhere near anything like that in the cell. Okay, so there are not 40 other parts somewhere else in the cell to account for all these parts that we see in the flagellum. But even if there were, even if you had, over here you had you had something that could serve as a propeller once it got put in the flagellum. You have something over here that could serve as a U-joint, and you got something over here that could serve as a bearing, and you had all those things in the cell. The question is, how would you get them all together? How would they just all of a sudden, all of them come together at one time and be assembled in the right order? Okay, it's just not feasible. So we've talked about these problems that evolution has, and that neo-Darwinism faces. And the question is, well, what do scientists do about that? Because they recognize this problem. Some of them do, recognize many of these problems. And oftentimes what you'll hear people do is they'll give you kind of a God of the gaps argument. Okay, so we've talked about God of the gaps before. So oftentimes the criticism that's labeled, that's directed at us as Christians, when we reject things, when we reject ideas like Darwinian evolution, is they'll say, well, you just believe in a God of the gaps. Okay, and of course the idea of a God of the gaps is that God is to us just a placeholder that we put in when there's something we don't understand. So if I see something, if I see lightning and I don't understand, I say God did it, you know. Or if I see if I see something over here and I can't explain how it happened, I just say God did it. Okay, and the naturalist, the materialist, he says no, there's material explanations for these things, and you just have a God of the gaps, and the more explanations we find for these things, your God gets smaller and smaller and smaller until he doesn't exist anymore. Of course, I don't know any Christians who believe in a God of the gaps, right? That's not how we view God. But what is interesting is that's really what many Darwinians are doing, okay? They have, instead of a God of the gaps, they have a science of the gaps, right? And so when they're confronted with these problems, when they're confronted with these questions, oftentimes they'll say, well, we have no idea, but eventually science will find the answer. And they're continually telling us science will find the answer. And in this area of the diversity of biological life, they've been saying that for 150 years, right? So it starts with Darwin himself. So Darwin knew that there were these huge gaps in the fossil record. He knew that. But he said, eventually we'll find it. After we do enough research, we will find all those various intermediate steps and intermediate species. And so really what you have oftentimes with Darwinians, we're here 150 years later, and we're not finding answers to the questions we had 100 years ago, and we're getting more questions. Okay, so it's kind of like the Darwinists are kind of like compulsive gamblers. Okay? They're always promising to pay their debt in the future, you know, and they just keep going further and further in debt. Okay? So sometimes they get even desperate. So, for example, there's a species of monkeys that lives in both Africa and South America. But according to whatever tree of life they want to embrace, the origin of that species of monkeys occurred after Africa and South America split apart, okay, after the tectonic movement split those two apart, okay, according to scientific theory. So they actually, the origin of the monkey was after the Atlantic Ocean developed, right? So the question is, and they believe they originated in Africa, so the question is, well, how do you get, why do you have these same monkeys then in South America? Well, the explanation they actually offer in scientific textbooks is that these monkeys actually got on a raft and floated for who knows how long across the Atlantic Ocean to South America. Okay? When you think about the impossibility of a dumb monkey, you know, figuring out that he wants to transport himself across an ocean that he doesn't even know what's on the other side for however long, and have the food and be able to reproduce during that period of time because he's going to be out there for a long time. How a monkey could even do that is incomprehensible. But this is actually offered in scientific textbooks as an explanation. And then another explanation that, and you actually encounter, and this is widely accepted theory, the theory of convergent evolution. Okay, so the idea of theory of convergent evolution is you have two different species that didn't originate from the same, supposed out of the same branch of the tree, so they come from different branches of the tree. Okay, but they have very similar feature, like an eye that's very similar or whatever. Okay, and so the idea is, well, we have convergent evolution. We have evolution happening in two separate places, virtually identical evolution. So now you have not only the problem, all the problems of evolution occurring once, but now you have to say it happened twice and arrived at the same destination in the same period of time. Okay, it's just their desperation becomes pretty clear when you begin to see some of these answers. So there are a number of scientists who are evolutionists who are beginning to go, wait a minute, we've got to rethink this. Okay, we've got to come. Of course, they're naturalists, they're materialists. They're not going to run out there and say we believe Genesis. Okay, so that's not going to be their answer. So they've got to find out some kind of way to find an answer for these explanatory deficits that they're encountering. And so what they're looking for is some way to adapt or change, maybe a little evolution is necessary here, to change the Darwinian theory or to adapt or to add to it. Okay, so this is called the extended evolutionary synthesis. And this is an attempt by Darwinians and evolutionists to try and figure out a way we can adjust Darwinism to answer many of these problems that we're encountering. In fact, they had a major meeting of leading evolutionists, biologists, and life science guys about 5 years ago in London, England, at the Royal Society, in which they came together specifically to talk about this extended evolutionary synthesis and see if they could come up with some kind of an explanation. Okay, and so they had this big conference, and actually by the end of the conference they still had not come up with any kind of agreed answer that or addition that they could make to Darwinianism that would resolve these problems. So in just the time we have left, I want to just think then a little bit about the interface then of Christian faith with this whole idea of evolution. And there are typically three responses. We've talked about this before, and I want to go over this again. There are typically three responses. The first, before we get to that, the first thing we need to recognize is that even if evolution were true, that doesn't say anything about the existence of God, right? Even if evolution were true, it doesn't say anything about whether or not God exists. Okay. Now it might raise some questions about how you interpret the Bible or whatever. Okay, but it doesn't say anything about the existence of God. That is, in fact, a philosophical or theological issue. That is not a scientific issue. But what is true, and what we've seen from Alvin Plantinga, is that if evolution is true, then there's no way to know that naturalism is true, right? And we've talked about that before. We talked about it again last week some, all right? So I'm not going to go into that now. But there are three general views among Christians, okay? So I'm not talking about theists in general here, but I'm talking about Christians. There's theistic evolution, there's what's called old earth creationism, and young earth creationism. And again, we've covered this briefly in the past, but let me go over it a little bit more in detail. So there are what we call theistic evolutionists, all right? And theistic evolutionists are Christians who generally accept the Darwinian theory in whole. They just accept the whole package, the whole deal. Random mutations, natural selection, all the complex organisms of life evolve through this materialistic, naturalistic process. Okay, they believe in God. They believe God existed. They may believe the essential Christian doctrines of the deity of Christ, the resurrection, and that sort of thing. But in large measure, they accept Darwinian theory as a package. All right. But when it comes to the Bible, there are aspects of the Bible that they either dismiss as untrue. So particularly those aspects of the Bible that talk about science-related issues, oftentimes, not always, because there's great diversity among theistic evolutionists, but oftentimes their answer will be, well, the Bible was written by humans in the pre-scientific era, and so they really didn't know, and so they were just kind of guessing. So in other words, they pretty much reject the truthfulness of the Bible when it comes to matters of science. And what that means is that they also discount a literal Adam and Eve, which means that they also discount the whole idea of the fall. as it's represented to us in Scripture. Okay? And then the question is, what are the challenges that are faced by theistic evolution? And I think there are several major objections to theistic evolution. And one is what the theistic evolutionist is saying is that according to Darwinism, these mutations were random, but really God was directing them. Okay. Now the problem is that certainly appears like a logical contradiction. How can you have an unguided, guided mutation? Okay. Now actually I just read a theistic evolutionist this week. I was reading a paper. He was talking about something else, but this subject came up. And what he did was he redefined random. So it really wasn't random anymore. But I can assure you that all naturalist Darwinians define random as unguided in any way. Okay? And so when a theistic evolutionist says that no, the unguided mutations were really guided, he is actually redefining the term random from the way evolutionists typically define it. The other thing that's really puzzling to me is how many Christians are feeling compelled to embrace Darwinism right at a time when Darwinism is crumbling. So we just talked about the problems that are showing up, and the more that's discovered, like for example Behe's book just recently and the discoveries he explores. So the Darwinian theory is becoming more and more problematic, and even Darwinians are recognizing that. And while that's happening, there are a number of Christians that are thinking, well, this is a done deal, I've got to buy into it. You know, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. If there's any time for a Christian to say, wait a minute, I'm not buying this, now is the time. And then the third problem, as I've already alluded to, is the view is just theologically objectionable on several points. Okay? So, for one thing, for most theistic evolutionists, the idea is that God is not involved in the life process. Okay, so He may have got things started, but after that, you know, they just kind of happened according to the laws of nature. Okay, and they also discount the idea that God is involved right now, sustaining life and sustaining things. He triggered it, he set it off, and it's just running. Okay, that seems to go completely contrary to Scripture. Scripture teaches us that God did in fact create various life forms, a variety, however you define species. He certainly, according to the Bible, created specific organisms, a variety of organisms, or a variety of groups. And that He continues to sustain them is clear in Scripture. Hebrews says He's holding all things together by the word of His power. So theistic evolution seems to call into question those two very crucial aspects of Christian theology. Furthermore, the theistic evolutionist says that God's action in the universe is not detectable. You can't see. So God was back there and He started it all, but you can't see it now. Now that runs directly counter to what Scripture tells us, because Scripture tells us the heavens are declaring the glory of God and the firmament is showing His handiwork. Paul says the things which are known about God, His divine power, His divine nature, and His eternal power are clearly seen, being seen in the things that are made. So here again, they seem to be running counter to Scripture. And then, as I've already mentioned, they reject the literal Adam and Eve. And when they reject the literal Adam and Eve, they reject the doctrine of the fall. And when they reject the doctrine of the fall, they call into question the whole Christian doctrine of sin and salvation. So the whole thing we're celebrating today is called into question by a rejection of a literal Adam and Eve. Okay? We'll talk more about the literal Adam and Eve next week. Then there are the old earth creationists. Okay? And the old earth creationists believe that the earth is very old. Okay? Millions or billions of years old. Okay? And most old earth creationists accept some version of Big Bang cosmology. But they also accept the authority and the reliability of the Bible, and many of them are inerrantists, so they believe there are no errors in the Bible. Okay? When they view then those early chapters of Genesis, they don't understand them to be literal history, but they view them as truthfulness and speaking truth, and even being without error, but they view them typically as, depending on which one you're talking to, poetic history or metaphorical or some kind of phenomenological genre. We're familiar with the idea of the phenomenological genre in Scripture, so when the Bible says the sun rises and sets, the Bible doesn't literally mean that the sun comes up and the sun goes down, but that's how we view it. It's phenomenological language. And so some view the early chapters of Genesis in that way, okay? But they believe that God created life and created distinct life forms, but He may have done so over a long period of time. So this is where you get things like the what's called the gap theory, the day-age theory, and things like that, various ways of looking at and understanding the early chapters of Genesis. And then you have the young earth creationists, and young earth creationists typically hold to a literal 7-day creation week, 24 hours a day. The cosmos and the earth is relatively young, 6 to 10,000 years, 20,000 years old or so, but relatively young. They accept the authority and the reliability, and typically many of them are inerrantists. They view the early parts of Genesis as strictly historical genre of literature, and they tend to question, oftentimes they question the Big Bang cosmology, particularly the aspect of Big Bang cosmology that scientists today believe implies an old Earth or an old cosmos. Okay, so those are the three different ways that Christians have approached this whole idea of evolution. I think that that from a biblical point of view, I would never be able to be a theistic evolutionist. Okay, and also from a scientific point of view. Those other two views, I think, you can have some significant disagreement among Christians on those, and yet they can be really united on the truthfulness, the reliability, and the authority of Scripture and the cardinal doctrines of the faith. So next week, then we'll go into the real kind of the ultimate question about origins: is where did we as humans come from, and where does the science stand on that? Okay, any questions? Good, we've answered all your questions. I'm glad. Okay. All right, we'll see you guys next week. Happy Easter.